it's interesting to think about the dynamics that have led to where we are,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because there's so many moving parts and it's constantly evolving. And the faces are the same faces. Because when you get wiped off a GP yard, you go to another yard, you're still the same person. Still the same
Correct.
dope fiend, same convict, same addict, still got same hands. You know what I mean?
Right.
You can still, So I wanted to start off a couple things, just defining some terms, the non-designated program facilities, and if you could just give us a short rundown of those, so everybody kind of knows what we're talking about, that would
Sure.
be awesome.
Sure. So the CDC started, like I said, the non-designated program facilities. It's also called 50/50 yards, although that's a bit of a misnomer, and the integrated yards, right? So it's all talking about the same thing. And essentially, prior to that, you had general population yards, in same classifications and everything else, but they were just GP yards. And then you had, most recently before the integration, you had GP yards, and then you had S&Y yards, sensitive needs yards. So S&Y is really, but people say S&Y yard. To be on an S&Y, you need a chrono. You need to have a documentation in your file that says you're an S&Y inmate. They also have protective custody, like actual PC protective custody. But with the advent of the S&Y yards, many of those PC facilities either changed to S&Y or went away, right? And so you have like incorporated places for like the Manson type and Sirhan type characters. But that's a very, very small population within the California Department of Corrections. So they're kind of unique, and nobody really factors them into broader discussions, right? So you had GP and S&Y, and you needed a chrono to be on an S&Y yard. And you get that chrono for a variety of ways. If you're a gang dropout, right, then you can go to an S&Y yard. Eventually, I think you had to go through multiple steps and kind of processes before you actually get put out there. But S&Y yards function just like a general population yard in terms of, you got canteen, you have visits, you have yard, you have day room, you have whatever the general population has in those places, and sometimes even more, right? There was times, from my understanding, I've never been on an S&Y yard, but from my understanding, there were times that they had more privileges and more things like that, as kind of an incentive to get people to lock it up and go over there. When they said reintegration, we're going to, integrate these yards, what they said was you can now be on the same yard if you have an S&Y chrono or if you don't have an S&Y chrono. The default is general population. So now general population people would be housed with people that had S&Y chronos in their file. So thereby kind of getting rid of the idea of an S&Y yard and just getting rid of it.
Well, let me ask you, just for clarity, it seems to be that the 50/50 yards and the whatever names they have, the NDPFs, right? Non-designated program facilities. These are the physical manifestations of the programs coming out of Sacramento. Right, this is Sacramento saying we need to reintegrate, so we're going to create these facilities, and this is where we're going to do it, right? Because there's no that's what non-designated means. You're not GP, you're not PC, you're not SNY, you're not any of that. You're non-designated at this facility, right? That's what they're doing.
Yeah, this yard, right? This yard doesn't account for any other designations that you have. Meaning the S&Y one, right? Like that's really what everybody's, sort of talking about. That's the designation that they're ignoring. Is so you can have, I don't think the S&Y chrono goes away. I mean, to some extent, stuff in your C file and your central file kind of lasts forever, right? It's a log of your time, but I don't think you get rid of the S&Y chrono. It's still there. It just doesn't matter. Yeah. You're just able and eligible to be housed on one of these non-designated yards. So yes, that yard is not a GP yard. It's not an SNY yard. It's a non-designated yard, meaning people on this yard may or may not have an SNY chrono.
Okay, so I want to run through a small scenario here, an actual one that just happened.
Okay.
C-Mac just went back through, and he went to a 50-50 yard. In theory, if C-Mac messes up again and has to go somewhere higher designation, in theory he may have I don't know. Who knows what might happen? But there could be a question mark, right? Whenever he shows, he's got some splaining to do, right? If he hung out on a 50-50 yard, in theory. Now,
in theory, could be.
Well, I remember also you saying that your brother went through this. That you had a brother who showed up and he said, "Hey, I'm from the north," and they said fine, and they put him in a facility, and he did his time there, and then left from the facility, and then it turned out that that was a no good facility, right?
So yes, but different, and the difference there is at that time there was no such thing as non-designated yards, and so that's a little bit different because the politics within the north, right? In the mid 90s in particular, you had several yards in the state of California, a lot of times level 2s and level 3s, although there were level 4s, also. And but normally like level 2s and 3s. You had several yards where, and this is before the non-designated thing, before all that stuff. SNY yards did exist at the time, but there wasn't many of them. There was only a couple that had just barely rolled out. He went to a yard that was a general population yard, just a regular GP yard. However, the internal politics within the northern fraction said that we don't stay on this yard. So like there was bulldogs on the yard, for example, and at that time it was a fierce green light on bulldogs. So if you were a northerner and you was hanging out on the yard and there was bulldogs on the yard, yeah, you would, kind of like how you mentioned the C-Mac thing, but in a much more serious way, you would definitely have some explaining to do. So he came, but it wasn't a SNY, it was general population. He was a first termer. He didn't really know about prison politics, didn't much care. So he went to the prison that they sent him to. Sure. And did his time, right? When he came back, then internally it was like, oh, you left from Jamestown. Yeah, so what? I didn't ask you. That's where they sent me, and I did my time over there, and I wasn't a punk, and I handled my business. And well, you were there with undesirables. You were there with people that we deemed no good, and therefore there was a level of consequence. So that's a little bit different. Although, there's some, you could make some kind of connection sort of to the 50-50 yards now. Because if you're on an integrated yard, and again, I don't like the term 50-50. I use it because of the shorthand and because it's common, but I really don't like it. I think, especially as it applies to raza, as it applies to the north and the south, not that I speak for anybody but myself, but there's no such thing as 50-50, right? It's a drop of dirt, pollutes the whole pool. You know what I mean? So if you have one SNY type person, if you have one person with predatory offenses against women or children, if you have one person who's a known rat, if you have one person who's a dropout, and they're allowed to hang out on the yard and kick it, and you don't do anything about it, then that by extension makes you trash as well, in terms of the politics.
Sure. Okay. Well, my question is this. This seems to me like it would be incredibly disheartening to many young people that are from different barrios and gangs and things of this nature to get put in prison. Say you're already in a bad situation. You're going to prison, right? And then they send you somewhere and you're like, all right, I'm going to try to get out of this damn place as quick as I can because that's human nature, right? C-Mac goes, does his time, does his burpees, does what he's supposed to do, and goes home. And theoretically later on, as I said, has some explaining to do. This seems like it would be incredibly disheartening. And it would almost, it seems to me, I don't look at what they say things do. I look at what things actually do.
Good,
okay? Yeah. And this program, these 50-50 yards, to me, seem to be designed to taint a generation in the eyes of the power structures. We'll just taint their pool, right?
Sure.
Yeah, we'll taint their
100%.
pool. Yeah, and we're gonna. This is a dilution of power. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's. Yeah, I would agree 100%. That is the intent. The intent. The CDC has always, and I'm kind of following along in the comments off to the side. That's why
I haven't even looked at them, brother. I'm all on you.
Yeah. I'm not. I just want to say I see you guys and I appreciate you guys, but I'm kind of in the conversation. But I see. So the CDC is passionate about disempowering the so-called prison gangs, right? Disempowering those organizations that have a lot of authority over the convict population, and also making those organizations look increasingly unacceptable to the masses, right? It's you went through a whole season of like, if you were in Pelican Bay, you were the worst of the worst, right? These are people you would never allow these folks in your communities. They're the worst of the worst and incorrigible. These aren't just bad guys. These are the worst. Literally, these are the worst of the worst, right? So then, then the hunger strikes happen. The Asker lawsuit happens, right? A series of steps are taken. And the shoe gets, for all intents and purposes, empty. And the first people to come out of the shoe are those who have been back there. Because the Asker lawsuit, was those who have been in solitary confinement consecutively for 10 years or more and not as punishment for a crime. So you go to solitary confinement if you commit a crime. You have the potential to go to the shoe if you commit a crime in prison, right? Normally what would be considered a felony. Drug trafficking, having a weapon, stabbing somebody, that sort of thing. But those things, like with any crimes, those have ceilings in terms of what the punishment is, right? So if you murdered a correctional officer in the Department of Corrections, that is a 5-year shoe term, period. That's it. That's not you go to the shoe forever. It's a determinate time because it's a punishment. It's an action and a reaction. The gang validations, and this was the big issue legally for decades, the gang validation is not based on crimes. It's based on classification. CDC's argument over the years, including when I was filing writs and everything else, right? CDC's argument is, well, it's just kind of a coincidence that those who commit felonies in prison get reclassified to be housed here for punishment. And it also happens to be the place that we put validated prison gang members and validated prison gang associates. But that doesn't matter of classification, not punishment. So this dude whacks a CO, he gets punished and he gets put in the Corcoran shoe or the Pelican Bay shoe or the Tehachapi shoe. This person is labeled by reliable confidential informants that we don't have to tell you about as a gang member, as a prison gang member. They just happen to get rehoused, and it happens to be the same place as the dude who killed the SEAL, right? Because legally, those protections and those entitlements are different. And that was the argument, is this is punishment. If it's punishment, I have a right to face my accuser. I have a right to due process. I have a right to these constitutional protections that theoretically everybody in the United States has a right to when faced with a criminal issue. CDC said we don't have to afford you any of that because it's classification. It's an administrative decision, not a legal one. Mm-hmm. So those people in the lawsuit were those that had been there 10 years or more on this classification housing, not a punishment housing. Well, they get out. They now they get to go out to the yard. They get to go out to the main line, to the general population. And their movement was restricted. And it's not like they just got out and everything was great. They made life hard for them and tried to find ways to put them back in. But as the movement progressed and it became clear that you cannot just indefinitely incarcerate people to sue anymore, they sort of let up. Well, Madness didn't break out because prior to that happening, you also have this thing called the end of hostility, right? In which there's agreements made and there's understandings that are come to by people who have a lot of influence in spreading that word. So the worst of the worst get out of the shoe and they go back to the general population, and the people that have been called animals for so many years by CDC, they're drinking coffee in a yard and it's not pandemonium. It's not the end of the world. The yard did not erupt in violence. These savage prison gang leaders who are supposedly orchestrating murders on a regular basis from their little tomb of a cell and can't be restrained, and all they want to do is attack COs, and all they want to do is attack each other, and all this whole narrative.
I find that disingenuous though, because you know that whenever you get into the higher ranks, you're not the ones that is committing the violence anyway. So letting out the generals, the generals, mm-hmm. I mean, just as a term, letting out all the generals to play amongst themselves doesn't. They weren't going to fight anyway. If you put a Russian general and an American general in a room right now, they're not going to fight with each other. They're going to talk. No,
true, very true, and that talk happened back in the shoe, right? But I'm not saying that this was true. I'm saying this was the narrative that CDC pushed for so long. This is why these people need to be kept here forever, is because if we let them out to see the light of day, this is what's going to happen. And then that didn't happen, right? That it is sort of like, hey, joke's on you, Holmes. And CDC was pissed. This is my belief, right? CDC was pissed. Okay, how do we take the power from these groups? Well, the whole SNY thing was intended to take power away from prison gangs, right? Long before, in the 90s. Violence was at a high, everything was crazy.
Well, let me argue that though, because no. I would argue that the SNY is a result of the actions of the general population. What were we supposed to, if I'm a prison administrator, if I'm Sacramento, I'm going to play Sacramento right now. What am I supposed to do with these people? You've wiped 30,000 people off the yard. That's an estimate. That's actually a close estimate. There's about 30,000 PC or SNY sensitive needs inmates in the state of California. So what was I supposed to do with these?
Well, see, and it's a good question. Were all those people wiped off the yard, or were some of them dangled with the carrot and stick? In the sense of, not everybody on the SNY side was somebody that got whacked. You had people that would run up a drug debt, and I don't feel like paying their debt, so they go to the SNY side, right? You have people behaved in ways, sometimes, not always, but you have a number of circumstances in which people behaved in ways they probably wouldn't have otherwise, because they knew they could escape the accountability of being in the general population by just going to the CO and be like, hey, man, I don't feel comfortable here anymore. There was a time in prison in which the response to I don't feel comfortable here is, oh, well, it's prison. You shouldn't feel comfortable. Get the fuck out there, right? Mm-hmm. It was difficult for people to roll it up off a yard. Okay, but you're going to need to tell us a whole lot. You're going to need to snitch on a lot of people. Like, you need to make this effort of me taking you off the yard worth it, And with the advent of SNYs and like, oh, we're just going to kind of have these big yards full of people, now all of a sudden that's all it took. Hey, man, I just don't feel safe. Like, I don't really have anything to tell on. I'm not a real, affiliated with a lot of stuff. I don't know
much.
Yeah, like I don't really know anything except that I got a $50 paper of heroin and I knew I didn't have the money to pay for it. And this fucking dude's pissed, dude. So I need to go somewhere else, right? And again, historically, for decades upon decades upon decades, it was like, bro, you're gonna have to eat that, right? But you had less prisons in California, so it was more difficult to hide. Then you had this huge prison boom. So you got a ton of prisons. You got a ton of people coming into prison. And CDC says, we're going to make it real easy for you to lock it up, right? And I think with the hopes that, people are going to choose, because on the SNY side, again, theoretically, it didn't actually turn out this way. But I think from CDC's imagination, we're going to create these yards where these dudes who don't want to be under the strict thumb of these oppressive organizations can go. And they're going to get more yard time, and they're not going to be locked down so much because they're not going to be doing the crazy stuff that people obligated to gangs and under the influence of gangs do. They're just kind of, and we're going to give them college classes and better stuff on canteen and family visits. And that's going to make a significant number of the population want to go there. And the more we remove them from the general population, the more we dilute the power of these prison gangs or organizations or whatever. Well, what happened was they created a monster because they let all these riffraff lock it up off the yard and go to these S&Y yards and create this wild, wild west where much of that same behavior still exists. You still got people not paying for their dope. You still got people doing all kinds of stuff. You still got undesirables. But now there's no, to use your word, generals, right? There's nobody there's no rules. There's no structure, no pun intended. There's none of that. So the S&Ys become a free for all. And you're just like, oh, okay, cool. You got these dudes on the yard with chomos. Well, now the chomos get tagged and assaulted. Now these people, and now S&Y gangs form. And you create a whole new era of prison-based gang membership because of your misguided attempt to give folks a chance to get away from it. And you can't control that because there's no generational legacy the way that there is with some of these older organizations. And you don't have that. There's no discipline. There's no rules. There's no nothing.
Much more fluid.
Right. And so it's, there was a time, we don't work with the COs, right? Never did. But there was a mutual understanding of sorts. For example, if you got a homeboy in the yard and he's just being loud, talking shit to the COs, being disrespectful, this and that, the COs that have been around a while, they know how to deal with that. They're not going to yell at you. They're not going to argue with you. If they're cool, and I use that carefully, right, because they are cops, but if they're cool, they're going to go at the fellas and be like, hey, man, your boy over there in 142, he's doing too much, right? He's doing too much. And or you go hit a couple cells, right? And they search a cell or two, send a message like, hey, your boy's making my life difficult by being a jerk. I can be a jerk of a CO too and make your life difficult, right? And oftentimes, homeboy would be got at, right? And like, look, with some organizations and some groups, you kind of check your people before it gets that far. But I'm just speaking broadly.
You're bringing heat. You're bringing heat for no reason.
Yeah.
You're bringing attention to us for no reason.
And so, but that relationship, that connection, all stuff, that shit don't apply on the S&Y side. Who you gonna get at?
Well,
who's this? Who's that?
I want to go back. I want to touch on this real quick. We'll get to the S&Y, the forming of the S&Y gangs, and who's the, where the responsibility lays there. But if we go back to the genesis of this problem, we're talking about a population of people, undesirables for whatever reason, that have been isolated, wiped off the yard, or however they got there.
Right.
Okay. These people have to be housed. Now, all these generals been sitting in Pelican Bay and Corcoran or wherever else for all these years. They decide this sucks. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. We want to get out of here. But these are smart men, right? And so I have to believe they realized that they created this monster. They created these S&Y gangs. Okay, and I'm going to read you something. I'm going to pull something up here. By a California prisoner, April 2019. These are letters from California prisoners.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yesterday, we received our first group of general population active prisoners, and the whole event quickly turned into a spectacle. Over 100 prisoners flooded the yard last night in anticipation of these active prisoners. Their purpose was to physically assault these general population prisoners if they attempted to assault any S&Y prisoner. While I myself did not go outside, I am guilty of looking out the window in anticipation of seeing some violence. Once I saw how these GP prisoners were virtually swarmed, however, and once I heard and saw how some prisoners became giddy with excitement at the possibility of seeing someone get hurt, my mood changed from one of expectant spectator to one of repulsion, anger, and empathy. Most disturbing of all, however, was the officers literally abandoned these incoming prisoners to their fate. Officers, some not even in gear, simply waited on the sidelines for something to happen, while packs of SNY prisoners taunted, intimidated, and pushed up on these prisoners, asking them if they were here to program or get stupid, waiting for the wrong answers. All of the prisoners who came to this yard stayed. 100 prisoners stayed, general population. However, about an hour prior to this, other GP prisoners were taken to another yard where we know something happened because we saw everybody proned out on the ground. This brings me to a question. They had to know that this was happening. The generals had to know that things like this are happening. So now we're sitting back here. Let's say I'm from the South. Well, we know who my traditional enemy is.
Right.
So I've got that guy. And I'm not a super fan of the blacks either, right? Because that's kind of how it works. So I've got enemies here. I've got enemies here. And now I've created a whole set of yards where I can't go, where I'm going to get whacked. So I've just surrounded myself. And this isn't just, you can pick any of the gangs. It's not specific to the Southerners, right? Yeah, any of them, it doesn't matter. They're all in the same position. They've backed themselves into a corner where there's enemies on all sides. They had to see. Everybody knows you can't fight a war like that. Everyone knows you can't fight a war like that. So if I'm Sacramento, I look at that and I say, this end of hostilities ain't because they want out of the hole. It's not because they want to sing Kumbaya. It's not any of that. And it's clearly not because they didn't involve the Bulldogs. Right?
Well, and to speak to that, actually, and not including the Bulldogs, and mind you, I recognize a lot of names in the chat. What up, Frank? I recognize a lot of names in the chat. So I think you guys all know this, but just for anybody that's not aware, I paroled from prison in December 2005, right from the SHU program. So I was not in crisis. I haven't been back to prison since. So I wasn't there for the end of hostilities. There was not even such thing as the short corridor when I was there, right? The short corridor collective form where they took the validated folk, members, and none of that stuff was happening when I was up there. Now we had a door policy, right, which had been instituted before I got there, that was strictly between, we'll say, the North and the South, right, to use generic terms. But that was it. But the end of hostilities, if you read the language of, which I know you have, and if folks go and read the language of it, there's no accidental words in there. There's no accidental or unintentional hints, right? That end of hostilities was intentional to not include the Bulldogs and to not include basically anybody who is not in some form or fashion subject to the leadership of those represented in the signing of it. Okay. Things work a little bit different with the blacks and the whites because you're talking about an entire race of people that are then a very diverse group in terms of some are organized and some aren't, and some this and some that, right? But so that sort of blankets, everybody. But it was intentional, and there's language in there. I don't remember it off the top of my head, but there's language in there about kind of like convicts and righteous individuals, stand-up guys type of thing. And so all those groups, all the SNY groups, the Bulldogs, which is not an SNY group, to be very clear, right? But they were excluded on purpose from that end of hostilities. I don't think so. There's no way for there was no way for the convicts to anticipate CDC doing this reintegration thing at the time that the hunger strikes are happening and the lawsuit is happening, the push to change the validation and to get people out of the SHU. There was no talk, and I don't think it's reasonable to assume that folks were really thinking, you know what CDC might do is take all the PC cases and the GP cases, throw them together. That shit came out of left field. And
really?
So
really? I can remember thinking about it I can remember thinking about it the minute that I learned there was SNY gangs that were attacking people, and I learned about it whenever they attacked X-Rated. I remember years ago, and I said, "What is that?" And I said, "That's not SNY behavior. If you're attacking people, you're acting like a tough guy. You can go back to GP."
There was talk of that. So there's always been talk of, these fools go and get active on the SNY side, and they're, you hear chatter in prison, you hear rumors about what the administration might be doing, and you're in prison, right? You sort of
you're breaking an agreement. If I let you onto this yard to act a certain way, you're breaking the agreement by attacking people and gangbanging.
And CDC allowed for that, right? And even went so far as like to contemplate labeling the Northern Riders, as a prison gang, right? When its origins are not SNY, but the SNY time came pretty damn quick after their origins, right? For all intents and purposes, it's the SNY group. So yeah, we seen that, and there was thoughts and questions and wondering, like, are these dudes going to get sent back? And you would hear COs and stuff talk like, these fools want to go to the SNY side and get all hyphy. You wasn't throwing back in the GP, right? And obviously from a convict gangbanging, not really gangbang, from a convict perspective, and somebody that was in there and embraced what it was to be in there in the general population, it was like, yeah, shoot it, because we obviously didn't have a favorable view of those guys, and so it was like, I should run them back. They ain't gonna pull that over here. Again, my thinking has evolved a little bit on individuals as I've been out of prison for so long. So, but at the time, that was our general thought, and there's plenty who think that still. But these guys coming out of the SHU, there was no thought that CDC would actually do it, or I never heard any conversation about eliminating SNY and mixing them in the general population until CDC presented this proposal of the non-designated program facilities. And I think, so these guys coming out the SHU, was it all about kumbaya? Of course not, right? That's an element, but they, there's more to it. And I think anybody who kind of understands the lifestyle and understands the environment can read between the lines in terms of the various advantages to the lawsuit and the hunger strikes working and getting folks out of the SHU, right? And not all of them are sort of, we can go play hopscotch. It's a little bit more than that. But there was a feeling, I think it's safe to say on the part of some, I don't speak for anybody, it's just my thoughts, losing control a little bit of the yards, right? But whether or not that was happening, folks wanted out of the SHU. And so they came back, right? They get back to the yard. And that's why I grew up. I've seen you for a long time. Appreciate it. So they come back. They come out to the yard. And I think CDC sees that the end of hostilities is holding up. It wasn't just lip service, right? It was actual. The end of hostilities was maintaining. There was not violence, but there was violence internally with groups. So all of a sudden, instead of folks getting slashed with a razor for stepping out of bounds and getting removed, folks are dying now. The homicide rate, a lot of people are getting killed in prison now compared to a few years prior.
Yeah.
Really.
So I mean, and this brings us back to our problem, right? When left to their own devices, you're going to take a bunch of people's lives, right? And that's what got the generals put away in the first place, right? Right?
Except now the focus is internal because they know. See,
because you can't politic on nobody else anymore because it's an end of hostilities. So of course you're just going to politic on it. If you just put a yard with nothing but Southerners,
What,
you think they're all just going to get along?
Oh, of course
no.
Not. Yeah, that's and,
right?
and we've all been through that, right? Like any group segment, when your numbers get too deep, you know what happens? You start whacking your own people, because you have to have an enemy. There has to be a threat. There has to be an opposition. It's a pissing contest. So now it's you can kill your own people, right? Because that's your business in-house. You just can't do that to other groups because of this into hostilities.
Well, that's great.
And right, it still sucks.
I've still got, if I'm Sacramento, I've still got a bunch of dead bodies on my hands.
Right.
That I have to answer for. And I have to answer to these people's families.
Yeah. Yeah.
Many of which are influential in the community. These are my voters. They own businesses, because everybody's family's got somebody in prison. Even the powerful, right? Everybody's got somebody who's addicted.
I've seen some studies actually in the state of California in particular, before they started letting a lot of folks out. So maybe a better way to put it now would not be incarcerated, but just about everybody in the state of California, like literally almost every single physical being in the state of California, has a relationship or a connection, either familial or just kind of community-wide, to somebody who's been incarcerated in California. Right? It's maybe not in prison, maybe not gang members, maybe not anything else, but everybody damn near knows somebody who's caught a case. And from the top on down. So it did create a mess. That response of integrating the yards, I will say that it has, I hesitate to use words like successful or unsuccessful, because that's slanted towards depending on what lens you look from, if something's working or not working, right? But from CDC's angle, I don't think many people in prison thought that this integration would continue. And definitely some folks put a lot of effort. There was bloodshed, there was fighting, there was this, there was complaints, there was hunger strikes, there was trying to rile up the press. There wasn't a real public appetite. People tried. I was a part of some of those conversations. Like, people tried to get the public behind not integrating the yards in the same way that you were able to get strong elements of the public behind not having people in the shoe forever. And it just didn't work. It didn't translate. A lot of people that supported the Short Corridor Collective, that supported the hunger strikes, that were like, yes, these men in these cells forever for these labels is BS and it shouldn't happen, and it violates the international standards and all sorts of stuff, which we have been saying for fucking decades in prison. Like, we've been saying that. But finally the public caught on and really got behind it, elements of it. That group did not get behind stopping the integration. There just wasn't. The only real outrage, so to speak, from the public was the families of individuals incarcerated who were now put in positions to have to act in ways that they didn't want to and that they shouldn't have, in terms of mixing these yards. Like, you're on the type of yard that you're on. You're doing your time over. Whatever that looks like for you, whoever you are, you're on the yard that you're classified to be on. Those two groups couldn't mix. And it's always been known that they can't mix. And CDC mixed them and created artificial issues between those groups. I will say it has worked from, I think, CDC's agenda in reducing the influence of the gangs, because a lot of people are staying on those 50-50 yards, bro. And you don't have in pretty short order, if we really think about it, in pretty short order, there are not many quote unquote general population yards left in the state of California. There are not many yards, not prisons, yards that you can go to as a non-integrated person. And there's no level ones, there's no level twos. I think there might be like a level 3 yard here or there, maybe. There's a couple level 4 yards. Some of those level 4 yards, for example, in Salinas Valley, you have two 180 yards in Salinas, C facility and D facility, right? and those are split, C upper, C lower. So if you look at C facility, half of C facility, I don't remember if it's upper or lower off the top of my head right now, but half of C facility in Salinas Valley is Bulldogs, the Nueva Flores, and that's about it. And, you know, in terms of Raza cars, right? There's no Northerners over there that are beholden to the traditional power structure. There's no Southerners over there. There's no S&Y groups over there either, though, right? Like, it's a general population yard. It's a strict environment. No S&Y chronos. It is not integrated. It is GP. But they won't, you know, they ain't integrating with North or South either. And frankly, the North or South don't want to integrate over there. They've stated publicly that part of the end of hostilities is because there's an element within the end of hostilities agreement also that CDC is a partner in the agreement.
Check this
to the
out,
extent
though.
that they won't house people in hostile situations.
They call it the end of hostilities, right? But baked within the end of hostilities is the mandatory assaulting of
A ton of people.
whoever, right? If you step on the wrong yard, you have to pick somebody, you have to pick a target and attack somebody. Now, I find it ironic that people will say, oh, well, you know, CDCR, rehabilitation, whatever. It's not rehabbing anybody. They've created, left to their own devices, the criminal gangs have created an environment where it's mandatory for you to assault people if you get to the wrong yard. This is regressive.
And those wrong yards are
to the nth degree.
Economically. Yeah, those wrong yards are soon becoming damn near everywhere except
How's this good for your people? How's this what's best for your people?
It's not. But since when is what's best for the people the objective? This is...
I thought it was.
No, it's
what was it? Cesar Chavez in them?
Yeah, Chavez is dope, but Chavez wasn't a prison gang member. So it's
you get the reference though.
I know 100%, 100%, and that's right. That's why my response is what it is too, right? So if the argument is prison organizations, influential people in prison, however you want to classify it. I'm not calling anybody anything, right? But whatever groups want to call themselves or whatever, are they making it increasingly difficult to do time in California and be in their favor? Yes, absolutely. And some of them have been doing that for a long time, right? Hence, like I said, in part, the flow on the SOY. Now, not everybody on the SOY side is a victim, so to speak, of gang politics and gang stuff, right? People over there for a lot of different reasons. But in terms of the gang element, yeah, you lose a lot of manpower when you run a tight ship, right? And the tighter the ship is, the less room, you know, less people are going to be able to hack it. And now you've made it where CDC and the gang, it's a chess match. And on this one right now, CDC is winning in its chess match. Everybody wants to go to prison and be admired by the big homies. A lot of people just want to go through their time. A lot of people aren't excited to stay longer. And these ideas of sacrifice and these ideas of this and that, they're romantic, but they're less and less relevant. Because what is the, you know, when you say sacrifice, you imply that there's a benefit there, right? So, where's my benefit? And CDC has so many of these integrated yards. Like I said, the majority of them, right? I believe. I don't have exact numbers. I've been looking. I've been talking to people, and I can't find exact numbers on how many non-integrated facilities exist still, but there's not many. But I go to the joint right now, I catch a case, I go in there. By default, if I'm some random Joe Blow, they're going to throw me on an integrated yard. And it's easy for people to sit on the comfort of their couch, you know, and get online and, oh, bro, I'm active, I'm with the functions, I ain't gonna do this, I ain't gonna do that, and da. And a lot of people are serious about that, right? That's fine. I'm not pointing anybody out specifically. But then you pull up on a yard. It's not, you know, you're not seeing 1,000 weird chomos walk around with, you know, magazines with pictures of little kids on type of thing. Like, it's not necessarily what you imagine. I don't know what it looks like. I've never been there. But what you see is folks busting down, folks playing handball, some folks over here politicking, some folks. You see, for all intents and purposes, a normal prison yard. And what it sounds like from some of the public figures that have been going over there, like C-Mac, right? Not that I look to him for sage insights, but and listening to some of the other content creators who are connected to communities and individuals that are still a part of that rotation in and out of prison, right? And have hit these yards, these 50-50 yards. People just kind of, it's find your little group and rock with it, man. You know what I mean? You hit the yard, there's a couple thousand people on the yard. You find a couple, 4 or 5 people that are kind of on the same page as you. You know, they like to do push-ups over here, or they like to read books, or they whatever. And their GP normally, now they're on this yard, but they're normally a GP type people. They don't got no funny cases. They don't got no funny charges. They're not, you know, tattletales or anything else. And I just kind of like, hey, man, out of sight, out of mind. I just don't look over there. I just don't pay attention to that. I ignore the undesirables, and I just create my own little bubble on this yard. I didn't give enough credit to that social factor happening. And every person that stays on an integrated yard, for the main power players, right? Every person that stays on an integrated yard is another person that will never be on your roster, because you won't let them on your roster, because it doesn't matter what they did. But the fact that they stayed on a yard like that